The African Americans Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, and religion. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they had been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and with us today is Kenneth Knuckles, the CEO of the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone. Ken's been here before, and we're going to talk about what's happening in 207 in Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone, which we call UMEZ.
UMEZ. Thank you, Roscoe. Good to be here.
Well, tell me, what are the priorities for 207 in UMEZ?
Well, our priorities will continue, and that is to invest in 4 core areas that we believe in the aggregate propel economic development. We are investing in a major shopping center in East Harlem, the old Washburn Wire site you probably are aware of, 116th Street and the FDR. Mm-hmm. That is a project that's going to produce about 1,300 to 1,400 jobs. Mm-hmm. First new target in Upper Manhattan, a Home Depot, a Best Buy, and there will be a retail space for smaller entrepreneurs. So we are investing in retail projects, commercial projects that bring jobs and services. Secondly, we will continue to invest in the cultural industry. We believe that the strongest indigenous economy in Upper Manhattan is the cultural industry. That means obviously the Apollos and the studio museums of the world and the El Museo del Barrios. But it also means investing in art service organizations that support smaller arts groups and individual artists. Thirdly, we will continue to do small business lending. Small businesses are the backbone of the service economy in Harlem, indeed the entire city, but certainly in Upper Manhattan. And fourthly, we have just launched a workforce development project with 1199, in which we're going to be training, 1199 is going to be training actually, residents of Upper Manhattan to gain employment in the healthcare industry. Healthcare industry is probably the single largest job sector in New York City, something close to 400,000 jobs. As it turns out, 9% of those jobs are in Upper Manhattan. When you think of Columbia Presbyterian, Mount Sinai, North General, Harlem Hospital. So this is an area that will always have opportunities, and we think it only prudent to have Upper Manhattan residents, as many as we can.
Now, what are the geographical boundaries of the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone?
Southernmost boundary, Roscoe, is 96th Street. The northernmost boundary is 218th Street and Broadway. Mm-hmm. Essentially,
that's
it is
the end of the island.
That's the end of the island, essentially. The East River to the east, and the western boundary is jagged. It alternates between Amsterdam Avenue and Morningside. But basically, I think the westernmost boundary is probably Amsterdam Avenue going to a point, and then it goes over to Broadway. Broadway is certainly the westernmost boundary.
Now, you've been CEO of UMEZ for about 4 years.
4 years. When I was here last, I had just assumed the position. I assumed the position on the 27th of January of 2003. Mm-hmm. It's been, I think, a very productive 4 years, certainly the best experience I've ever had. Mm-hmm. We have invested in cash and bonds well over $100 million during those 4 years.
Well, now the UMEZ legislation, I think, provided, what was it, $200 million and then another $200 million from the feds?
It was $250 million mm-hmm. in equal increments of mm-hmm. 1/3 from the federal government, the city, and the state. Mm-hmm. In addition to the $250 million in cash grants, there is a $230 million triple tax bond increment as well. We have invested a total, actually we have put over $200 million in capital into the economy of Upper Manhattan.
So of the $500 million?
Of the $250 million in cash, we have about we have about $58 million left. And of the bonds, we have just over $66 million left to invest. So I dare say probably over the next year to 15 months, we will exhaust our initial grant.
Well, then the question is, what about reauthorization? What's the Congress doing about this?
Well, shortly after the election, Congressman Rangel told me, and as you know, the congressman authored the empowerment legislation.
And he's chairman of the Ways and Means
Committee. And he's chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, which is good for New York and I think good for the country. He has said that he intends to try to bring more capital to the empowerment zones of the country, certainly starting with the Upper Manhattan.
Would they reauthorize the legislation so they put an X number of dollars up for the next 10 years?
You know, I think it depends when the new infusion would happen. The current legislation runs through 12/31/09. So if it happens before then, I suppose our authorization can continue, because I think the legislation presumes that we will be out of money by 12/31/09.
And you will be.
Short of a new infusion, we will be. So we're optimistic about that, because there certainly is more work to do. We've accomplished a lot, but there's a lot more to do.
Now, what was the political and economic theory behind the empowerment zone concept?
The empowerment zone concept really was the Clinton administration's urban stimulus package. And by that I mean the empowerment zones were set up to take a combination of capital, cheap capital, and tax incentives to bring about job creation. You will remember, because you were one of the founding members of the Empowerment Zone's Board of Directors, in the mid-90s, early to mid-90s, unemployment in Harlem was 25 to 30%. As a result of the work that we've done, it is probably now about 9%. Now, that is way too high. It is well above, it's double the national, and it's nearly double the city. But it has had an impact. So the thrust of the empowerment zone was to take cheap capital and leverage private capital by providing below interest loans to entrepreneurs who were willing to come in and invest and create jobs for Upper Manhattan empowerment residents. We were able to leverage lots of private capital. The $150 million in grants and loans that we have invested so far has leveraged an additional $700 million in capital. I'll give you an example. The East River Plaza project that is in construction as we speak. We have invested a combination of about $57 million in capital into that project. $40 million in bonds and $15 million in subordinate debt, which means we are second behind a bank that's providing most of the capital. This is a project that will cost about $350 million. So that $57 million that we are investing in this project is leveraging about 7 times that amount in private capital. So we have done that across the board. And that was the purpose of the empowerment zone, to bring private capital into Upper Manhattan with the proviso that in order to get our capital, you had to commit to jobs. And as a result of that, we have created now about 8,500 jobs.
Now, when you take on subordinate debt, when does it get paid back? And if it gets paid back, or I should say when it gets paid back, does that go back into your cycle?
It goes back into our pool. We have lent about $68 million in loans. 25 million of that has been paid back. So that money will be recycled, as will the rest of it when we
what's the payback cycle? What's the
well, it varies per project. We have tried to keep our repayment cycles within 10 years or less. But in some cases, we've had to make exceptions. On the larger projects, we have done 15 and 20 years. But that's generally how they are structured.
Now, when Congressman Rangel conceived of the empowerment zone, and Harlem got one of the first empowerment zones, the business climate in Harlem wasn't very propitious. What impact has the increase in attractiveness of the business climate in Harlem had on the operations of UMass?
Well, it's brought about a lot more demand. I can tell you that.
Clearly, whenever people want money, they come to you.
We have a lot more demand than we have capital. But what it's done.
Then talk about that. Why do you have more demand, and what areas do you have more demand?
Well, we have projects, retail projects, commercial projects, where people want to. There's a project that's coming through the pipeline for Washington Heights, where people want to do a major retail development up there. There is demand for small business capital. There is a demand for micro-lending funds, which we are doing. Micro-lending is small lending, generally below $50,000. Generally, it is in the area of $5,000 to $10,000. So the infusion of capital and investment in Upper Manhattan, I think, has brought about, obviously, a reappraisal of Upper Manhattan. As a place
so it's more expensive to do business there than it was before.
It is more expensive to do business there. The real estate market has been red hot. I think it is starting to cool just a bit now. But the main thing, Roscoe, is that no longer is there Manhattan and then Upper Manhattan. Upper Manhattan now is a part of the larger market, certainly the real estate market, commercial and residential. So it has driven up prices undoubtedly, but people are investing. People are buying property. Commercial owners are seeking to reinvest in their properties. So I think it's a on the one hand, it's a good, positive, healthy environment, but obviously it is not without challenges. Small entrepreneurs, especially those who don't own their property, are being pressured now because of the escalation in rents. And similarly, the real estate market prices have risen, and you're seeing pressure in that way. I mean, people are selling brownstones. You know, you and I know people who have owned brownstones in Harlem for years and years. So when they decide to sell and cash in on this market, you know, brownstones now probably average about $2 million. The average sale price. Well, what happens to those people who have been living in those brownstones for years and years?
That really is the crucial issue that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
As Harlem becomes more attractive economically, it tends to price out many of the indigenous residents.
Right.
They have a lot of young people who've either inherited money or have high-paying jobs.
Right.
Many of them are not African American.
Right.
And some people are saying that the complexion of Harlem is going to change not only economically but ethnically. What's your opinion about that? Because I know you're right on top of that.
Well, Harlem has changed to a degree. It is more diverse, and frankly speaking, you see more whites living in Harlem than you did 10, 15 years ago. I do not believe, however, that there is a wholesale purge on the horizon for a number of different reasons. First of all, the city has undertaken, I think to its credit, an affordable housing program. 265,000 units they seek to build. A lot of that is going to be in Harlem. Secondly, most of the housing development that you have seen in Harlem over the last 10 years has been done on city-owned land, which means that in exchange for that subsidy, a significant portion of that housing must be affordable to people. Now, some will say not enough of it is, and I don't think there's any disagreement, but there is affordability components built into most of the new housing that has come on board. Thirdly, Harlem has still a lot of public housing in its midst, and Mitchell-Lamas, the Riverton, the Delano, Esplanade Gardens, Lenox Terrace, all of these buildings that were built in the late 50s and early 60s, and that African American population is not going anywhere. And then there's the New York City Housing Authority. Finally, there's a cultural component to Harlem. that I think is intractable. There are the churches, and there's the artistic presence. So I think all of those things taken together will preserve the Harlem that you and I know, but it will change, certainly on the margins.
Well, what's going to happen when Columbia takes over the West Side? See,
well,
that is an issue that a lot of people in the Harlem community are concerned about, because Columbia for years didn't consider themselves part of Harlem. They were Morningside Heights, but now they want to go into the West Side by the Hudson River and take over properties and so on. So what's going to, and by the way, I should point out to the audience that Ken Knuckles is on the City Planning Commission as well, and you have had to make some decisions. So I don't want to compromise your particular public position, but I would like to have some observations about this challenge.
I thank you for that caveat, because I was about to say it. Ultimately, you know, I, along with my 12 colleagues on the Planning Commission, will sit in judgment of this proposal. Columbia has to make its case, which is to say that this expansion is not a one-way street, and that it will inure to the benefit of the community in terms of jobs, in terms of procurement, meaning that there's an opportunity for the business community in Upper Manhattan to do business to a far greater degree with Columbia University. My understanding is that they have committed to building a school somewhere within that footprint,
a public school
for Upper Manhattan, and they're going to be doing research there. So this process really will begin with the certification of the project by the City Planning Commission, which means that there's been an environmental impact statement that has been put together by Columbia. And that will begin the process, the so-called ULURP process, the Uniform Land Use Review process, which means that the community boards, and then the borough president, and then the City Planning Commission, and then ultimately the City Council must all weigh in and pass on this. So Columbia will have to make its case that this is a project that will obviously help them, but will help the community. So I, like others, will evaluate the project. I mean, I was at Columbia for 7 years as a vice president, as you know. I think Columbia, by and large, is a force for good. But still, this is a project that will radically change Manhattanville, and the burden is upon them to demonstrate that the benefits will have a ripple effect in the community.
I know President Lee Bollinger and Vice President Maxine Griffiths have been going out to the community, and because Columbia has had such a wide gap between themselves and the community, there's a certain amount of distrust. On the other hand, you articulated a number of things that have to happen. The City Planning Commission, the Community Board, the City Council. Those things take time, and they will have hearings, etc. And probably the most important thing is to build trust, because Columbia, because of its alienation from the African American community, has had to go a long way in terms of building trust, and they have done a number of things. And as anyone who's viewing this program knows, that there is always interaction between the powerful and the powerless. Right. And one of the things that the powerless have is people and land and culture. And that's the reason why this discussion will go on. One of the things you did talk about is U.S. investing in job development and the healthcare industry, but all of a sudden Governor Spitzer is going to cut out half of the money that you guys are going to get to do work training. So what's the future of that project?
Well, you know something, I think that debate is not going to be resolved by competing advertisements. At the end of the day, the governor and the healthcare industry
and the legislature
will sit at a table and negotiate these cuts. I am certain that at the end of the day, there will be a resolution that both sides will probably be dissatisfied with, but supposedly good negotiation is if both sides feel that they got some of what they wanted, but not all of what they wanted.
Well, one positive thing is that regardless of the expansion, there's always replacement, because workers retire, they move to other jobs, and the healthcare industry is so important and requires such specific skills. And 1199, Dennis Rivera have done a great job of building their workforce, so that I think it probably is a win-win to invest in job development. What other kind of job development would you be involved in UMass? We
are doing a construction training program. You know, the construction industry is still very strong in the city. With HCCI, the Harlem Congregations for Community Improvement, led by Lucille McEwen. We're doing a construction training program with them. As I said, we're doing the workforce development with 1199, and we are probably going to do another workforce development module around the service industry, jobs in hospitality. For instance, we expect before we're done that there will be a hotel somewhere on the 125th Street corridor.
Are you involved in that?
Well, we will likely be, because whoever emerges will likely want to talk with us about funding. And we think that we are past due in terms of a hotel. Downtown Brooklyn now has 2 hotels.
But downtown Brooklyn's downtown.
True, but the 125th Street corridor, with all of its attractions, as well as the larger footprint of Harlem and Upper Manhattan, get enough traffic now for a hotel, I think, to sustain business. So I think sooner or later, and I think sooner rather than later, you are going to see a hotel develop there. And we will need people to occupy those jobs. The service industry in this town, people make very, very good livings working in hotels.
Yeah, particularly when they have good tips.
Exactly. And that's another area that I think has been overlooked, and there needs to be a focus on it. So we will be focusing on that area of workforce development.
Tell us about the arts. I know you're a fan of the arts personally, and UMass has made certain contributions supporting the arts. What are you doing in that area?
Well, you know, we arrive at UMass and in Harlem with the backdrop of the richest cultural history in this city. No community, I dare say, in all of New York City has a richer cultural history than Harlem and Upper Manhattan. So we're building on that legacy by supporting the Apollos of the world.
The Apollos of the world, or the Apollo?
Well, the Apollo, obviously. The Apollo Studio Museum, El Museo del Barrio. There's a terrific new venue in Upper Manhattan, right across the street from City College, called Harlem Stage, which was the old water plant there on 135th Street and Convent Avenue. We are working in East Harlem. So we know that the cultural economy, just as it is in New York City, is something that will propel jobs and dollars coming into the community, because when people go to the Apollo, when they go to the museums, when they visit Harlem Stage, then they will also go to restaurants. And to that degree, the more money that restaurants receive, the more that they can expand their workforce. So it's a cyclical economic impact, and we think that investing as we have probably invested $25 to $30 million in the cultural economy. We will invest more because it nurtures the soul on the one hand, but it also will create jobs.
But suppose I wanted to start a recording studio. Could I get money from you for that?
We could talk about it.
Well, see, that's why you're very skilled. But one of the things that you did invest in at some time was capacity building for cultural institutions.
Yes.
Which had to do with their planning, their marketing, and so on. Because many cultural institutions do not have good planning.
No, you mentioned an instrumental point. Generally, before we invest money in a cultural institution, in most cases we will do technical assistance to look at just the areas that you're talking about. What is your plan? To the extent that we invest money, and these are grants, I should mention.
They're not
these
loans,
these
grants.
aren't loans, these
right.
are grants. We give grants to nonprofits. So where's that capital going to? If you have a capital expansion program, what does it mean? If you have a senior leadership that calls into question longevity, then what is your succession program? What is the programmatic vision of your organization? Harlem School of the Arts is another entity that we have worked with. So in each and every instance, we will generally engage in technical assistance prior to making the ultimate investment.
Well, clearly, UMass has had an impact on Harlem, and clearly Ken Knuckles has been an outstanding leader in that. Today on African American Legends, we've been talking with Kenneth Knuckles, who's the CEO of the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone, better known as UMass, and we've been talking about their plans for 207, and we're glad to have you with us today, Kenneth.
Thank you, Roscoe. Thank you for having me here.